Chew on this for a second. A full frame, 24 megapixel sensor capturing images at 30 frames per second, 6K video, ProRes and external RAW recording, and hardware better than any other camera at this price. This is the Panasonic S5IIX. So I think the camera industry is due for another wake-up call, and maybe this is going to be the camera to start it. Enter the Panasonic S5IIX. Actually, I think the last camera that really pushed the limits of what cameras could do at this kind of price point was the Panasonic GH series, and now we have a full frame edition, and this one has a few new epic features that really push that limit even further. See, the Panasonic S5IIX has some of the most amazing hardware and features I've ever seen on a camera, and there are a few things that this camera does better than anything else currently on the market, and it's really once you start to use some of these tools that it's tough to go back to using anything else. So a little context, back in December, Panasonic released the S5II, a full frame 24 megapixel camera with 6K video, pro level features, extremely rugged hardware, and phase detection autofocus to finally rival Sony and Canon. And honestly, if that was all they had announced, I would have been really impressed. But Panasonic pulled a one more thing, and the S5IIX was born with a fully blacked out body, with the only exception being this red record button. And I think every potential video codec, format, aspect ratio you could ever want from a camera like this. And when you see just how powerful all of this can be, you'll get why I'm saying this camera is shaking things up. So here's what's been added with this new X version. And in some ways, it's not really as much as you would expect to warrant a completely new model, because even though the X is more of the video focus of the two, Panasonic didn't withhold much of anything from the standard S5II. So the X really just gives us all of the things that involve some form of like licensing or extra cost to Panasonic to get onto this camera. But if you're a videographer, these are major features and really take this camera from like the consumer, prosumer market to being a very professional tool that you could really use in any situation. So now you can capture video at pretty much any compression you want. You have H.264, you have H.265, just a ton of bitrate options. You have 10-bit 422, and then on this camera, you have the all-eye codecs up to 600 megabits per second internal, and the all-eye is where every single frame is being retained rather than just like the differences between the frames. But probably the thing that most people are going to be excited about is ProRes 422, and this can be up to 1.9 gigabits per second, which is just insane bit rates. And if you're wondering how the camera can actually record that, because there's dual SD cards and that's about it in here, this is another feature on the camera. External USB recording to USB-C hard drive. So you can basically just take a drive like this, attach it to the camera, and then now you can get 5.8K video in ProRes 422, or if you're shooting the all-eye compression, if you go out to the USB-C drives, you can get 800 megabits per second onto those drives. But also, this is just really awesome because if you want like virtually unlimited recording, you can get 4 terabyte SSD drives, and these are really like $300 for these. I think the highest end SD card, high-speed V90 cards, is going to be about 500 gigs, and those are so much more expensive than 4 terabytes. If you want to get like unlimited recording, the USB-C hard drives are just awesome for that. Plus, you get raw video output, and that can be encoded either as ProRes RAW to the Atomos recorders, or you can use B-RAW to Blackmagic recorders. So just a ton of different options on there. Plus, you have basically any aspect ratio you could want: 16:9, 17:9 DCI, a 3:2, which I use a ton, or 4:3 recording. Now, the S5IIX also adds direct streaming options, which I do wish were on the regular S5 too, but basically the camera can broadcast directly to Facebook or to YouTube Live via Wi-Fi, via USB, or a LAN cable, and you can do this up to 4K 60 depending on how you hook it up. And this just makes it so easy to do live setup straight from the camera itself. Now the hardware features on this, they're just insane. And I promise I won't be hitting all of them. We'll just be hitting the highlights that I use personally because we could be here all day. But hit me up in the comments if you guys want to see like a full breakdown on the camera. Definitely sub because there's more videos on the way. And I promise there's some that you're really going to want to see. And I also put together a kit of all of my favorite lenses, accessories, the recorders I would use, memory cards, basically everything that you would need to run the S5 II and the S5 IIX. So links for all of that below. But a few standout features. So when you pick this camera up, you can just tell that it's built extremely well. Obviously, Panasonic has been making extremely high-end pro-level cameras for a while now, but I first started using them probably about 10 years ago, and even back then, they were just super rugged, they didn't overheat, and they could handle just about anything. So 10 years later, this is just one of the best full-frame hybrid photo-video cameras, and it's one of the only ones that doesn't overheat. And the reason is that there's actually active cooling hidden up inside of here. And I live in Florida and I overheat cameras pretty easily down here. So this is one of the few cameras that can survive an entire outdoor wedding for me down here. But the customization on this is just insane. And it took me a little bit longer to set up the way that I love it, but all of your buttons are customizable. You also have a D-pad on the back that's fully customizable. You have this Q menu with another 12 custom buttons on it. And you have a touch tab, which I'll use for things like weddings. And this gives you touch control of your things like shutter speed, aperture, volume, and a bunch more custom functions that you can set up as well. So if you don't want the camera to shake at all or make noise by, turning these dials, this is a good silent way of making those adjustments. But here's why I love this camera. So I usually will end up in situations, kind of unfortunately, where I'm shooting both horizontal format and then I'm gonna have to repurpose that content for IG or some other vertical format. And say you're shooting in like 16:9, this is horrible. It's not fun, it's so hard to compose and then be able to format for both. But what's awesome is this camera is that you can actually set it to 3:2, which is actually the native aspect ratio of this actual sensor. And so this means that not only are you getting that full 6K width, but you're actually recording additional resolution at the top and the bottom. So now it is a 6K by 4K frame. So if you want to vertically reframe this in post, you actually have a full 4K frame that you can pull from this. And for horizontal, you still have that 6K. So now you can punch in like crazy and still have a really awesome 4K video. And doing this on full frame cameras at this price point with these kind of features, that's just insane. And for those of you who just write off vertical video as some trend fueled by Gen Z influencers that spend more time on TikTok than behind a camera, those aspect ratios actually make this one of the most powerful cameras that you can get for using anamorphic lenses. So throw this camera into one of those 3:2 or 4:3 formats and you have some really awesome D-squeeze options for anamorphic, and the camera actually has the D-squeeze built into it, so you don't even need an external monitor to use anamorphic lenses with this. Now, definitely a situation I find myself in pretty often is that usually I'm shooting video, but I'm also needing to be able to get photos at the same shoot, or going there for photos and need to be getting video. It is extremely difficult to find a camera that is this good at video with these pro level options that can also be a hybrid camera and shoot amazing photos without having some kind of compromise or limitation. So this is a 24 megapixel backside illuminated sensor. It's extremely good quality. You have 9 frames per second in mechanical shutter. You have 30 frames per second in electronic shutter. You have built-in in-body image stabilization, and all of these images that you see here were edited with my new Phoenix preset pack. And as a little bonus for you guys, I'm gonna throw in a coupon code in the description. So if you want to pick those up, definitely check that out. But seriously, these are what I'm using for all of my edits, and I've tested these on a ton of different cameras, so check them out there. But this is probably the only camera under $4,000 with this many pro-level video features that also doesn't have really any shortcomings when it comes to making this a pro photo camera. Now, probably one of the biggest changes for this camera was a phase detection autofocus, and I've quite a few Panasonic cameras from a few years ago, and they were amazing with like point-to-point autofocus, but if you needed to just continually do smooth tracking, they all struggled. But this now has phase detection autofocus built into the sensor, and with this improvement, it is a night and day difference than before. So all of my B-roll, all of the A-roll that I have on this camera was actually shot with autofocus on. So autofocus is finally to the point where I can use it and I can pull off some crazy tracking shots. I still think the interface looks a little bit more like a fighter plane display than camera focusing, but also if you're using manual lenses that don't need autofocus, Panasonic has always had some of my favorite like manual focus tools, and I tended to use those a lot with the cameras like the GH5 and GH6. So why should other camera manufacturers actually be worried about this camera? I mean, this isn't even Panasonic's flagship camera line. This doesn't have the fastest frame rates in the world. Well, for the longest time, I think Panasonic, they always separated themselves in some way from the competition. So most of their cameras had micro four thirds sensors, for example, while Canon and Sony invested heavily into full frame systems. And even when Panasonic eventually did go full frame, it took a little while before the lens selection filled up, their hardware really came into play, and things like autofocus really got on par with the competition. And I think that last piece of the puzzle was autofocus, because until this camera line, there was always one area that Panasonic wasn't the same as the competition, and now that's over. Essentially, this is going head to head with every other full frame camera out there right now, and there is a lot that Panasonic gets right. The hardware, the ergonomics, the features, multiple aspect ratios, anamorphic, and now all that is being combined with a really good full frame photography camera with solid autofocus, and the result is something that on paper, it stands out, and obviously the specs are amazing, but over the last 6 months, I've been putting that spec list to the test, and the result is, I think this camera is now the wake-up call this industry needed. But let me know what you guys think of the S5IIX. Have you actually had some hands-on time with this camera? What specs stand out to you? But I'm actually really curious, like how many of you guys use more of those like advanced codecs, so things like all-eye recording, ProRes, if you guys are shooting external RAW to recorders? Let me know in the comments below if those kind of things are important. Also subscribe, because I got some new stuff on this camera coming out and some new cameras on the way soon. So stay tuned. A lot of stuff is going on soon. I also have a video on my 7 favorite features on this camera. So if you're curious, if you're looking at this camera, check that out, as well as my favorite gear and accessories and everything else you need for this camera and the S5 II. I hope you guys are doing amazing. Stay tuned. A lot of new stuff on the way.